Welcome back. So, at the end of the previous lecture, we were talking about sort of visual culture and how it gives us an idea of the formation of middle class identities shaped by globalization, right? So, I had given the example of the two films you see on screen. Just to sort of repeat what I had said before, the individuals represented here were very much seen as sort of aspirational figures, especially not just for members of the new middle class, but also for those who are upwardly mobile and wanting to enter this group. There's a scholar called Rachel Dwyer who's written quite extensively on Hindi cinema specifically and its cultural impact, including through the 90s. Of course, do keep in mind that these weren't the only types of films being made in this decade following liberalization. There were many other types of films as well. But there was some kind of difference in genre that we started to see emerging, very much informed by social, political and economic changes at the time. This was not just in Hindi cinema or English cinema, but even in other regional languages. Now, let's move on to how the idea of the new middle class intersects with employment, right? As I had said right in the beginning, this lecture is about globalization, class and work. And while there are many aspects that we can explore in terms of globalization and the middle class, we've already spoken a little bit about consumption. I've highlighted some other work that has been done in the realm of globalization, class and gender. And even in a theme like consumption, I didn't even go into detail on various other forms of consumption. It's for example, it's not just cinema, but also the huge expansion of TV channels, TV programs, English TV channels that came in and how this shaped identities in this period, right? So, there are many things we can discuss, but what I want to focus on here is the realm of employment. And because this links very much to what Fernandez has to say, in that she says when she is talking about globalization creating a new middle class, as I already said, she is talking about the new forms of work that have emerged because of globalization and how these create a new middle class, right. So, that link is very, very important. I am going to quote her here again. The expansion of the service sector of the economy and of professional white collar private sector employment has been fundamentally linked with the rise of the new Indian middle class, right. So, she is very explicitly making this link between the rise of the service sector, which absolutely boomed following the expansion, the opening up of the economy. And really private sector employment at this time created a vast array of new jobs. At a structural level, the new middle class is not comprised of new entrants to middle class status, rather it is defined by a change in the status of jobs, which now signify the upper tiers of middle class employment. Do keep in mind that when she is talking about the middle class, her categorization refers very much to one of the many, we could call them middle classes, the upper tiers, right. As I said, the sort of English speaking urban middle class. Of course, since the time that Fernandez has written her book, it has been shown that even the jobs she highlights have become opened up more and more beyond the sort of what she calls the upper tiers. But nevertheless, this is a very useful way of analyzing these themes. So, she continues, the socio-economic boundaries of the new middle class are shaped by the shift in the direction of new middle class employment aspirations, right. In symbolic terms, this is important, the cultural and economic standard for the old middle class would have been represented by a job in a state bank or the Indian civil service. Members of the new middle class aspire to jobs in multinational corporations or foreign banks. Okay, so, she is again making this, she is highlighting specific jobs and professions and saying that really this old or traditional middle class, you would have seen them much more before liberalization in bank or IAS jobs, right? But the new middle class aspires to jobs in this new private economy, in MNCs and foreign banks. And again, since the time of the publication of this book, we can see that the economy has expanded even more. The digital space has created so many new types of jobs, whether it's content creation or digital marketing, and the emergence of what's known as the creative and cultural economies, including in India. So you see the sort of diversification of this space, and this is very much linked to going back to the initial changes brought in by globalization. Okay, coming to the Indian information technology industry. So why are we speaking about this industry specifically when I have already said there are so many industries that emerged as a result of globalization? Well, the IT industry is perhaps most emblematic of the changes that have come in. It's the largest private sector employer in the country, continues to be, and really the figure of the techie has dominated certain aspects of popular culture. Even in films or TV, you will often see the IT worker represented a fair bit, and especially intersecting with themes of migration, diaspora, mobility, and so on, right? So it's a particularly important sector to analyze from the perspective of class, middle class identities, and globalization. Now, to give you a brief history of the Indian IT industry, let's see, the birth of the Indian IT industry can be traced to the early 1970s. Very important, right? Again, we have to remember there's always a long history. The IT industry did not simply come into being in 1991. We can trace it all the way back to the early 70s, but of course 1991 represented a point when it was able to expand exponentially, right? But we do need to keep in mind the longer history. So, when the central government first began to promote software exports and the inclusion of computer science courses in higher education institutions. In 1984, the government under then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi released a computer policy that officially recognized software as an industry, with subsequent policies further easing restrictions for investors, right? Again, we see that there were changes happening right through the 80s. Now, with the economic reforms here we see of the 1990s and the launch of the Software Technology Parks of India STPI in 1991, this emerging industry was allowed to simply flourish. So, a government, or the STPI is a government organization that provides IT companies with well-equipped physical spaces for conducting business, allowing foreign companies to offshore their software and service requirements directly to Indian sites, while domestic companies also benefited from the availability of suitable infrastructure, right? So, we see that the expansion of IT parks, if you visit really most metro cities in the country now, IT parks are quite ubiquitous, especially in certain parts of those cities. So, really the expansion of these physical spaces as well as the economic reforms which significantly reduced barriers to the inflow of foreign capital allowed both foreign companies to offshore work in India, as well as allowed for the growth of domestic companies. And as we know, there are now several massive IT companies in India. I don't think I need to name all of them because they are so well known in our understanding of the Indian economy today, right? So, it really allowed for this tremendous expansion. Now, also here do keep in mind, this was combined with, and this is where the middle class could come in, the availability of a technically educated, relatively cheap English speaking labor force, right? This set the path for the rapid growth of the industry. When we say relatively cheap here, we mean compared to the cost of labor in countries in the global north. India provided workers who had to be paid salaries at much lower rates, right. At the same time, they had good technical education. We have a huge number of engineering colleges in India. Also English speaking, very much a feature of this new middle class, and all these factors came together to allow this industry to flourish. Now, at this point, also do remember that the IT industry is itself quite diverse. Besides say the production of hardware, which is on sort of a smaller scale, I think perhaps the two sectors that are most well known are ITES, so IT enabled services, and software, right, the production of software services. Now, for the sake of what we are discussing here, I am going to focus more on the latter, on software services. ITES is itself a very interesting area to study, and there has been quite a lot of research on call center workers, on people doing things like medical transcription, data entry. All this sort of falls into the ITES space. But for the sake of this lecture, let us stick to IT services, which is primarily software, because this group tends to be a little distinct from the ITES group, and perhaps fits in somewhat better with Fernandez's conception of the new middle class. They tend to have usually engineering or science degrees, and as I said, they tend to have more characteristics of Fernandez's new middle class, right. Now, just to represent the sort of the physical spaces of this new industry, as I said, those of you living in metro cities would perhaps find these quite familiar if you have visited metro cities, and increasingly these sorts of constructions are also appearing in smaller cities and towns as the industry keeps expanding, right, as they keep looking for more and more labor essentially. So, what we have on the left is the Infosys campus in Bengaluru, and on the right is what is known as the IT corridor in Chennai, in the city of Chennai. It's a 6-lane highway dotted with several IT companies and these massive IT parks as well. And so, to sort of digress a little bit, when we talk about globalization, it's also very interesting, and this is something human geographers have worked quite a lot on, to look at the intersection of globalization with changes to both the built environment, that is the changing nature of the landscape of cities, the constructed landscape, right, the sort of buildings that come up, as well as the natural environment, right. So, how do all these changes, how does this construction impact what we might consider what is known as the sort of more than human, right. So, it's quite interesting to also, on a sort of side note, consider how the emergence of the IT industry, a lot of which was due to the processes of globalization, has shaped our actual physical surroundings. But I am not going to get into this in detail. Now, what I want to discuss in the final part of this lecture is really how we can tie IT work more specifically to the processes of globalization. We have already established that the expansion of the industry was largely facilitated by the opening up of the Indian economy. We have also established that this sort of new middle class, as Fernandez puts it, has very much gone into many of these sort of IT jobs that have come up because of these processes. But if you look at the specific theories of globalization that you have encountered during this course, how can we actually apply those to IT work as it happens today in India, right. So, let us discuss this a bit. Here I am quoting Upadhyay and Vasavi's report. They say the rise of the global IT industry and the spread of modern information and communication technologies, or ICTs, have been inextricably linked with processes of globalization, and the transition to a post-industrial economy in the advanced economies of the North. The more recent phenomenon of outsourcing of IT and other services is a central part of this process, right. So, if you look at what Castells, for example, has called the network society, what Upadhyaya and Vasavi says that this spread of ICTs has to be seen as part of the processes of globalization that have resulted as well in outsourcing of IT to countries like India. We have to keep this within our frame of analysis. Upadhyaya and Vasavi also make the interesting point that the way Castells conceptualizes the network society is not in every sense applicable in an Indian context, because the access to these ICTs is much more uneven in India than in, say, as they call it, the advanced economies of the North. But nevertheless, we can certainly apply that lens to studying IT work here, right. They continue, under the regime of flexible accumulation, David Harvey, production is increasingly organized through transnational production networks or global commodity chains that link together diverse economic entities across the globe, from huge transnational corporations to small family firms, through various kinds of subcontracting and outsourcing arrangements. Even large multinational corporations or MNCs have been restructured, very important, from vertically integrated bureaucratic organizations into network enterprises composed of semi-autonomous entities that contract out work to one another. The development of these flexible forms of organization has been accompanied by the flexibilization of labor as well as increased mobility of capital. Now, let us kind of read through this a little more closely. What Upadhyaya and Vasavi are saying is not necessarily that now you are seeing greater linkages across different countries in terms of production of commodities or services, because certainly that was happening even before the period that is widely associated with, say, the network society or with globalization. Certainly before the 90s in India, you are still seeing what is known as a Fordist mode of production, where goods would be produced in countries of the global south because labor was cheaper, their production was cheaper, and then sold in countries of the global north. So, these sort of chains, the global commodity chains as they call it, did exist even then, but the distinction they make is in how business has become increasingly flexible, right. Companies have to adapt tremendously to constant changes. I think one of the key characteristics of the phase we are currently living in is the need to constantly adapt and change, and seen as almost a requirement of sort of living in this contemporary period, right. And this is really what these scholars talk about when they speak about flexibilization. Companies need to be more flexible, labor has to be more flexible, and there is also this increasing mobility of capital, that is, capital can flow much more freely across the globe. And as we have already established, the economic reforms of 1991 in India specifically really helped to facilitate that. Now, the next concept I want to spend some time on within these theories of globalization is the idea of time-space compression, which you would have encountered when you studied Harvey. It's a very fascinating concept. Basically, Harvey says that as globalization has taken place, the time separating different parts of the world and the actual physical space between different parts of the world. So, I could be thousands of kilometers away from someone, but we can still be connected, we can still be talking in real time, right. So, there is a sort of compression of this space. Large quantities of space can be incredibly compressed. Similarly, time differences can seem to be less and less important as things also speed up, right. So, when he talks about compression of time, it is not simply the collapsing of these differences, but also things getting faster and faster, which is facilitated by ICTs and other changes brought about in recent years, right. So, to quote Upadhyaya and Vasavi again, they are speaking now in the context of the Indian IT industry. Globalization has despecialized work and production, as economic organizations and individuals located in distant sites are linked together through complex economic and communication networks, blurring temporal and spatial boundaries, right. So, they actually call this process despecialized work. It's almost like space has ceased to matter, right. So, people located just in very disparate parts of the world can now be linked together, blurring these boundaries that seem to exist earlier. I will highlight though at this stage, and this is something we will come to right at the very end of this lecture, that processes of time space compression do not always follow a sort of equal trend. You might notice that people in certain parts of the world face more pressure to sort of compress than people in other parts of the world. Certainly with the global service industry and what is known as the knowledge economy, or IT work, you will see that people working in India and other countries in the global south expected more often to be flexible in terms of their time, right. And this is certainly something that we need to revisit, this idea of power asymmetries as a result of the process of time space compression, and we will come back to this. Now, returning to Upadhyaya and Vasavi, as they say, the global IT industry has been both the facilitator of the new economy as well as one of its primary industries, and the back end and low end software services providers such as India have played a central role in the development of this economy by enabling work to be performed faster, cheaper and around the clock. Again, who is having to work around the clock? As Castells notes, the distinctive feature of the new global economy is its capacity to work as a unit in real time on a planetary scale. So, it is quite a grand conception, essentially, that the whole world is able to work in sync in real time, right. To come back to the point they make earlier, it is very interesting. They say that the IT industry has both allowed this new economy to emerge because it facilitates the use of ICTs, but it is also one of its primary industries. So, the work that is needed to keep the IT industry going is also one of the main reasons that the new economy is what it is today, right, that shapes new economy work. So, it is quite interesting to look at it that way. And they highlighted again how India has played a very important role in these processes. And as I have already said, the idea of time space compression is certainly applicable here. This is also because the work that is done in the service sector, and especially in a sector like IT, relies primarily on what is known as immaterial labor. You are not producing a tangible product. You are producing, it's reliant on perhaps cognitive labor, right. So, you are trying to produce something that you can't physically hold most of the time, and this allows it to be transmitted more easily across the world. Now, the last concept I want to discuss before we get to our final slide is the flexibilization of work, another key theory in study of globalization. This is certainly something that has been thought about to a great extent in terms of the IT industry, which is characterized by longer hours compared to forms of work that existed earlier, especially for the middle class, more contract based work, right. So, this means that the work is somewhat less stable, it is more contingent, right, less job security, much like in other segments of the globalized economy. So, because the economy is seen as needing to be quite fluid, what happens is that there is less job security, there is more of a hire and fire policy, there is more of a tendency to hire people for shorter term contracts, and there is also somewhat of a tendency to try and go around certain labor laws, certainly not something restricted only to the IT industry. but nevertheless this industry can be situated within the much broader trend globally of increasing precarity in work, right. Precarity is essentially the state of precarious work, of instability, of this feeling that that something could change at any moment and take away your job security, right. It's something that is seen as characteristic of many types of work, not just in India but globally. And this is also seen as an important feature of flexibilization. So, of course, the question is then, why do people want to do this work if it's so insecure and whatnot? Of course, we know that IT jobs pay well, especially as you move up the ranks, and there is scope for job progression and upward mobility once you enter an IT company, especially in software services rather than in a space like ITES. Definitely in IT services there is more scope for that. So, there are of course some incentives that make this kind of work desirable, but increasingly there is now a sort of pushback that we see, where this is not always seen as enough to justify some of the challenges that come with working in this space. And this could perhaps at this time be a new way of looking at the Indian middle class. Since 1991, the last 30 years, how has this group shifted, and especially in terms of IT work, how has its identity shifted as this work becomes more and more precarious and insecure and difficult, right. Now, going back to flexibilization, we can see that it definitely manifests in situated ways, right. That means local context plays an important role in how flexibilization operates. I am going to quote Upadhyay and Vasavi again here. They say, while the Indian IT industry depends on flexible forms of employment as in the US, the key axis of flexibility is somewhat different. Indian software services companies need to be able to quickly deploy workers on projects, send them on site or bring them back to India as needed, and then shift them among different technologies and platforms. So, here what they are arguing is that flexibilization, as conceptualized by some of the theorists based in the global north, often focuses on flexibilization of the individual. But in India, they argue that this seems to be more at an institutional level. Companies are expected to be extremely flexible to meet the demands of clients, right. And again, this brings the question back to, are employees also expected to be flexible in this space? Yes, of course. I mean, as we have already seen, the nature of the job requires these things like longer hours and more contract based work and so on. But nevertheless, they say that we can observe differences in what it means to be flexible in countries like the US and in India, and this is why we need studies that on the ground look at how these theories can be applied, right. And this is what Upadhyay and Vasavi have tried to do. Now, to conclude this lecture, I am going to conclude with a provocation of sorts. I want to go back to my earlier question about power structures in the global economy. This is something that for critical theorists in particular is very important and does need to be analyzed in some depth. In the context of the Indian IT industry, what are the power structures that operate? I have already spoken a little bit about time-space compression. I want to here bring you to some of the research that I have done. One of the aspects of my work on the Indian IT industry, specifically in the city of Chennai, is looking at adherence to workplace sexual harassment legislation. Now, some of you might know that in 2013 a law was passed that made it mandatory for companies to set up mechanisms to address workplace sexual harassment, and I wanted to see in the course of my research how this was being implemented and what were the underlying factors behind it, right. Now, the IT industry, to contextualize this, the IT industry has demonstrated a particular reliance on foreign clients. In fact, the very foundation of the industry was built on exports. This has deeply influenced its institutional growth, right. So, this sort of reliance has definitely impacted how the industry is today. This particular dependence of the IT industry on foreign clients and on the unpredictability of the transnational economy distinctly impacts both corporate policies and employees in their localized settings. So, here I want to bring you back again to this figure of the new middle class IT employee, right. So, how is this person impacted by the embeddedness of the IT industry within the global market, within these transnational flows, right. So, what we see is, while the industry is undoubtedly placed within a broader system of complex and non-linear transnational flows, as Appadurai has argued, certainly we can't say that it is a simple hierarchy that we can establish between say clients and companies. It's definitely non-linear and complex and needs to be unpacked in various ways. Nevertheless, we have to consider the power geometry of these movements. This is a well-known formulation by Doreen Massey, a very famous human geographer, who wrote this essay in 1994. And she spoke about complicating this idea of globalization and of transnationalism by understanding what she calls the power geometry. How is power allotted between different groups, right, and different settings? What is the balance of power? And again, in the context of my research, what I found was that in terms of the workplace sexual harassment law, domestic adherence to domestic legal frameworks was seen to give companies greater legitimacy in the global market. Now, this is not to say that foreign companies are inherently better or more moral or anything like that, but this is simply how the sort of brand image of companies is shaped by their perception of what is required from them in this sort of global marketplace, right. And this became a factor in how they framed their workplace sexual harassment legislation. And now, as you can perhaps imagine, with this idea of legal compliance as linked to brand image being one of the factors in how companies approached this idea of workplace sexual harassment legislation, it had some implications for how they actually practiced handling cases, and how it ultimately impacted the figure at the start of this whole lecture, which is the new middle class IT employee, right. So, we need to always situate our work within these multiple angles to sort of get a better picture. Thank you.